Hey, hello, and welcome to another episode of our Integrity 365 Financial Insights podcasts. So I'm Coreena Dutton. I'm a Chartered Financial Planner here at Integrity 365, and I'm joined today by my colleague Marcus Rea. And we're here really just to discuss a number of things around guiding your family through financial planning at divorce. So thanks for joining me, Marcus. Good to see
No
you.
problem. Good morning. Yeah, hello to you too.
So in today's episode, we hope to unravel some of the complexities of financial planning during divorce. So whether that's that you're going through it yourself or that you're concerned about a family member and want to offer them some support. And we'll be discussing key topics on things such as financial administration, protection, support services, mortgages, pension arrangements, estate planning, a number of things really that tends to crop up. So I guess really the first thing I wanted to talk about is, I suppose, why we're talking about this. Obviously, a lot of people are going through a divorce, as it stands. A lot of people go through it. A lot of family members go through it. But I think for myself, quite often I get into conversations with my clients who are worried about a son or a daughter or a family member or a close friend that are going through it, and they want to sort of help and support them. So it's not really just the people themselves and the sort of closer family members, but it's also the wider friends and family network as well that are impacted. So I guess that's kind of where a lot of my client discussions come in. I don't know about yourself, Marcus.
Yeah, similarly, I mean, one of my best friends is separated. I mean, talk of divorce has risen its head, but hasn't developed as yet. But certainly, having conversations with my clients also, worries of their own children going through the pangs of divorce as well. And a number of clients also, the stats don't lie, so to speak. And unfortunately, according to the ONS, 45% of first marriages will end in divorce. And sadly, I'm part of that statistic as well. And I know how difficult it was for me personally, both for my ex-wife, my children, but also my surrounding family and friends as well. So yeah, first-hand experience myself, but also seeing others go through it. It can be very difficult and challenging for all involved. And some people will be able to handle it emotionally and so on better than others, and that primarily will be due to support, whether that's emotional support from friends and family, but also support by talking to the right people at the right time, people like us. I mean, I'm sure you probably share the same sort of experience in that regard.
Absolutely, yeah, and we'll talk about the importance of getting the right help and getting it quickly, I think, as time goes on. So I think divorce itself has come on a long way as well, really, hasn't it? Since sort of the traditional route of having to sort of go through court and everything else. I mean, there's something such as called a no fault divorce now, really, which removes the previous law's requirement to establish one or more facts to prove that the marriage is broken down, which I think is a
Yeah.
big difference, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that wasn't available to myself when I went through the divorce process. Unfortunately, it does make divorce a lot easier now for people, which, in some regards that might be a positive. In others, it might be a negative, because I'd like to always think that each part of the dynamic would try their hardest to make the marriage work, because nobody goes into marriage wanting their marriage to end. But a no fault divorce, it allows people to kind of separate more amicably and not to have the blame pinned on one of the other parties. I mean, it can be emotional. One person prior to this coming into play having to accept, a part of the role as to why the marriage might have irretrievably broken down. That can be difficult to stomach. And so I think things like this are a great addition to enable people to divorce more quickly, more easily, perhaps less painfully, but it does also make it that much easier to get divorced as well.
Absolutely, because it's not just quite often these things happen amicably. I've got friends that have been through it who are still very good friends, and they worked through it logically, and they made sure that it was done properly for the kids and everything else. And I think that actually that the industry has opened up their eyes to that, and that's why these sort of things are sort of being put into place to be made that little bit easier. But it's not always that easy, and everyone has to, make sure they've got the right support network behind them, which, as you mentioned earlier, is why it's really important to make sure you get the right support early. Um, Everyone assumes divorce equals solicitor, and you've got to, immediately go down that route. But actually, it's probably not the most logical first step. I mean, I would say, sort of dealing with something emotionally first is probably the first logical step, be that in the form of counselling, or be that in the form of, speaking to family and friends, or something which is, newer to the market, which is a divorce coach. And I know there's a number of divorce coaches around the area that I work in that I've spoken to previously, and they're not a counsellor, they're not a lawyer, they're not a financial advisor, but they're basically somebody who can help, with the early stages of contemplating a relationship breakdown, and working through building a new plan one step at a time, getting your emotions in check, making sure that the decisions are the right ones, because I don't know about you and what you went through, Marcus, but when you're making such important life decisions, the worst thing you want to be doing is making those decisions when you're in the wrong headspace.
Oh, I completely agree. It is an emotional journey. I mean, I believe there's something called the 7 stages of grief. And, I would implore people to allow your time to kind of go through that process before kind of committing yourself to divorce proceedings, because you won't be in the right emotional frame of mind to be able to cope with what's to come otherwise. That's my own personal opinion. And through that kind of period, I did a lot of self-help, like kind of reading, just to kind of gauge my own emotional kind of feelings I was going through. I did a lot of that, and that really helped. But as you just mentioned, there are other avenues, divorce coaches being these new things. I actually personally went to a counsellor, and I still to this day think it was possibly the best money I've ever spent. Other people might use friendship groups and family. But what I would urge people to always do is to make sure you are kind of dealing with the emotional pains that you will go through. And some possibly you might least expect, think you're ready and things, and it'll come back round and bite you, unfortunately. But the help is out there. It could be anybody. And I said, there are varying areas of support. And I think once you've gone through that emotional acceptance, if you like, certainly at that point, at least getting some legal advice would be extremely advisable.
Absolutely.
Because obviously you need to have a good understanding of your shared assets and liabilities, and being able to discuss that with solicitor. And you might have an idea as to how you think it might get split in a divorce, but a judge and other people might look at it completely differently. So you've got to have a good picture as to what you have. And I suppose that's the kind of area where I'm sure yourself, Coreena, you'll have clients coming to you, and they'll say, "Look, I'm going through this process. Can you just tell me what I've got? What assets do you look after for me?" I mean, is that something you come across, Coreena?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always think, when going through this kind of thing, having 3 types of expert behind you, someone for the emotional side, someone for the legal side, and someone for the financial side, is absolutely crucial. And it's also really important to get someone like myself or you, Marcus, involved earlier. A lot of people quite often might come to see us once the financial settlement's been agreed, which is all very well and good if it's something quite simple, and actually, that was always going to be the case. But actually, it's more and more important for people to come and see us earlier, because you might have a situation where, for example, you might have a couple, one of whom is more financially savvy, has been at work, the other person may have been at home looking after the kids, and not working as much as a result, and they might not have been building up as much pension as a result, and things like that. And it's crucial not only to make sure that the sort of asset split is fair, but it's also crucial to make sure that there's sort of fair split of future income. So, for example, it might not be a 50-50 split. There might be one party in the relationship who's got significant pension assets. The other party hasn't really got much in pension assets. And actually, if you split things 50-50, that party that wasn't able to put money away into pensions for all those years while they were looking after the kids potentially won't be as well off as that person that
Mm.
was, because they'll still be able to carry on working and building up their pension entitlement. They might need more than 50%. And the best way of finding that out is by speaking to a financial advisor and sitting down and looking at the overall picture. We can use things such as cash flow modeling, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail a bit later on, really just to give a wider picture of sort of not only equality now, but equality in the future and retirement, for example. It is absolutely crucial that that's looked at early doors, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just kind of establishing what level of equity there may be to share as well, if any. You know, if you're fortunate to be a homeowner in the UK as part of the marriage, you know, establishing what equity there might be to put towards potentially two new homes. I mean, there are times when, you know, the mother, for example, might retain the family home, and there may be a charge put on a property, and the other party might not get any equity back from the home until the children are a certain age, for example. But if you can get a clean break, where you are effectively, for a financial consent order, kind of completely stripped away from your ex-partner from a financial point of view, and you can share that equity to put towards potentially two new property purchases, that's when you might need to speak to us or to a mortgage advisor, for example, to see how much you might be able to borrow with regards to purchasing a new place. If that's what you wish to do, either immediately or further down the track. It might be that you choose to rent, you know, first of all, until you establish a routine with your ex-partner. If there are children involved, certainly, and where you might want to live and how that's going to work. But certainly speaking to the right people again at the right time. So as you said, speaking to us about your equity position, your asset position, even then going through to a mortgage advisor to see what you might be able to borrow to potentially buy that next property. I mean, is that something that you would also agree with there,
Yeah,
Coreena?
absolutely. And I think another point on that is, like you were saying, you know, whether you might want to rent for a bit. And actually, you know, that might be a sensible option, because a lot of people, you might find a couple, and one of the parties in that couple might want to stay in the family home because the kids have obviously had a lot of upheaval and everything else, or just, you know, it's just a comfortable place to live because they've always been there. And they might want to live in the family home. And quite often I've heard of situations where they've basically said, well, look, I'll keep the family home, you have the other assets, be it the pensions, be it whatever else. And then all of a sudden they're left with the home, probably bigger than they would necessarily need as time goes on and the children get older, for example. But what they haven't got is a pot for retirement potentially, which is what they could have had if they'd have shared the other assets and maybe sort of thought about it. And actually, that's where the emotions come in again. It's kind of like, well, actually, yes, I want to continue living in the family home if I can, but is it the most logical step to just have a house and not anything else, for example? It's, you know, it's kind of building in those, you know, head above your heart situation and actually thinking
Yeah.
about it logically for your future.
I mean, this ties in quite nicely with our cost of living webinar that we did recently. And you know, if we look at the recent cost of living, I mean, Stowe Family Law, a law firm, say they're you know, they're getting people talking to them about problems in their marriages due to the rising cost of living. With that, that's dovetailing with people's mortgage rates, which have increased hugely for many people over the last couple of years. Um, and that sort of strain can put a strain on the relationship itself because there's less money in the household. But if you're in that situation where you, through the divorce process, have taken on that house on your own and the mortgage rates increased, is that indeed the correct thing to have done by allowing the other party to have had all the assets? You know, it is unfortunately quite a difficult thing to get right. And that's why it's absolutely imperative that you get the correct advice at the correct times, and not try and do these things on your own.
Absolutely. I think that builds on to really a bit of a discussion around cash flow modeling, to be honest, because it's a system that we use to be able to sort of show visually the impact of certain decisions, I guess, really, isn't it? So you know, obviously you could show your long-term financial position, you know, in a visual way, and look at a different number of scenarios, be that keep the family home, sell the family home, take on some of the pension, etc. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about scenarios when you've used cash flow modelling.
Yeah, I kind of had to utilize it in my own situation in some respects. Fortunately for me, I have a financial background, so I knew what both my ex-wife and I could borrow in terms of mortgage rates and things, and I had an idea of equity splits. So, where I can take that on board with clients is, I can build that into a cash flow and say, right, well, I believe, if we talk about it, even if you just start from a 50-50 position, if a client's starting out on that divorce process, there's no kind of finalization to the divorce and you just want to get an idea as to what things might look like, we can build a forecast based on what half the equity, half of this, that, and the other might be, and put the basis of a plan in place, and to see what sort of income and what standard of living you might be able to interpret from that a few more years down the line. And the beauty of that is once we've built that forecast and the cash flow plan for you, as things change, we can then obviously plug in a few of those changes into the cash flow and see how that picture might change for you from a financial perspective, and what quality of life and standard of living you might be able to expect once things are finalised. But to do that, we do need to know, what pension provision you have, what savings you have, what investments you might have, the value of your home, the outstanding balance of your mortgages or loans and credit cards. The more information we know, the better the advice we can give.
And also, I think it's important to try and have a little think. And I know it's not always easy, but to try and have a think about when retirement might happen, what sort of income you think you're going to need to live on, where that income's going to come from. Like you say, it might be that you or your ex-partners have got, significant pension assets, and it could be that we could plug in, like you say, 50-50 split on those to give us an idea as to, sort of what that retirement's going to look like. Because it's not just now when it happens, it's making sure that you're not giving up future income later on. So like you say, if it is that scenario where one party keeps the house and the other party keeps all the pensions, that's all very well and good. You get to live in a lovely house for a bit, but actually when it gets to age 60, 65, are you going to have the income you need to then retire, or are you going to have to sell that house and live in rented accommodation? So it's really just looking at those wider scenarios and a long-term plan.
Yeah, and I this is all dovetailing with speaking to their legal advisors as well. Some people are fortunate that they've got defined benefit pension schemes, also known as final salary. These are kind of few and far between these days, and it might be that you get something called a pension sharing order or pension earmarking and things. These are kind of jargon you might hear. All of which might enable the kind of party who doesn't hold that pension to benefit from that pension in future to ensure a shared division of income in the event of a divorce. So, these are all things that we need to be aware of as well. So that will come about through the kind of system you mentioned earlier about having the legal representation, the financial representation, and really enabling us to build that picture of what things might look like for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, that there probably are different pension, in place, depending on the age that you end up getting divorced. And it's not always people that are, sort of relatively young. Quite often we're seeing more and more people in later life that are getting divorced, in which case they might have pensions that are already in payment. They might have old defined benefit pensions from years ago. There might be a combination of different pension types, and they may need to get an expert pension report, which is usually put together by an actuary. And what that will do is it will sort of give the whole scenario, looking at all of the plans with the aim of ensuring a quality of income. And that's not just now, but it's in the future as well. So that's really important, because it's very difficult to know what you've got and what sort of income it's going to produce in the future without somebody, who's such as an actuary who's able to actually calculate this in detail, to be able to put it together and show it in black and white. And that will really help to work out, what's going to be sort of split. And then you can come to someone such as ourselves who'll be able to then simplify, demystify that report, because they're not the simplest reports quite often. So you might need somebody to sort of break it down into sort of bite-sized chunks, and then we can look to implement sharing recommendations, for example, once an agreement's been reached.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think this also further areas of consideration are things that you might have shared as a married couple are things like life cover as well.
Yeah.
Life cover that may have been in place to protect a mortgage or future income needs and things like that. What sort of kind of questions do you get raised in this area, Coreena?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it comes from the very start, really. Even when you've got like a young couple who are just sort of setting out together, and it sounds awful, but even in those initial conversations, I quite often say to them, well, actually, do you want a joint policy? Because the likelihood is that you can actually get a policy each for very similar amounts of money. They don't widely different. You might end up spending a couple of quid extra, but actually to future proof that cover, is it worth having a policy each? And I know it's awful when you're speaking to somebody who's just sort of setting up and sort of moving into their first property, but it's quite often a very valid point that actually if you do have a joint life cover policy, the provider might not be able to actually split that cover in the event of a divorce. It means you might have to apply again. It means you might have had medical issues at that point, which means that getting new cover might be difficult. There's all sorts of issues there. So and also it gets more expensive as we get older. So actually setting up life cover and illness cover is a lot cheaper when we're younger. So there's that conversation initially to say, well, actually, do you want a joint policy that potentially can't be split if anything were to happen? Or would it make more sense to spend a few quid extra and actually get one each? Obviously, you've got double the cover as well. So there's, double bubble. But, that's one thing. But also, I guess at the other end of the spectrum is when you've got people that are coming to you that are divorcing. It's looking at those policies and it's contacting the providers and it's working out whether they can be split. Because I know some of the newer providers, for example, newer policies, that they do have the option to actually look to amend cover without further underwriting. Not everybody. Again, all the more reason to speak to an advisor. And then, look at what cover requirements are required, because especially if there's kids involved or whatever else, that there may well be, additional needs at that point that you need to get extra cover in place.
Absolutely. And it might be that, for example, kids, as you mentioned there, ensuring that there's going to be enough money set aside for future weddings or, helping to fund them through higher education if they want to go to university and things. And that potentially joint income no longer there anymore. And, what are you going to do if something happens to you? You probably still want your child to benefit. And there's ways in which we can ensure that happens. And just going back to a point you made earlier, a lot of people are now divorcing in later life. I mean, according to in general, 3 of divorces in the UK are for people over the age of 50. So it is a growing trend. It is now easier to do. But one thing to do for certain is to not forget your life planning, your life cover and serious illness cover. And as Coreena mentioned there, the first thing you should be doing is speaking to your advisor in that regard and making sure that you are fully protected, and as is your wider family dynamic and your future aspirations.
Absolutely. I guess the other thing off the back of that is you might have policies in trust, for example, life cover policies, that kind of thing. And one key thing is to remember to update the beneficiaries on those policies, because the last thing you want, if you pop your clogs, is all your life cover going to your ex potentially. So you want to make sure that the right cover goes to the right people, and that's not just life cover policies, is it? You've got pensions that are in trust, so you might want to update those to the children as opposed to your ex, for example. And then I guess things like wills as well, really important to make sure the wills are updated as well.
Yeah, and also you mentioned there about pension nomination forms, but also most employers, if you're fortunate enough to have a death in service plan through your employer, you'll have a nomination form that you need to update with that. So going through this process, yes, you need to update who you might want your future pension benefits to go to, but also don't forget other benefits that might be provided by your employer. Just ensure that you've nominated the right people in that regard too. But as you say, obviously, upon divorce, any will that you might have had prior to that, it becomes null and void, I believe. And
yeah, it does. Yeah.
And you're going to need to make a new will. So again, extremely important. If you want the right things to go to the right people at the right time in future. You've got to have all of that in a legal document.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really important. So I guess another thing that I wanted to just pick up on really is things like estate planning consideration. So I know, for example, there's a number of my clients who are thinking of gifting, be it now or be it via their will. But they're worried that potentially if they were to do that, then all of a sudden, if for example, an older couple end up leaving X amount of money to their daughter, for example, via their will, and it all goes directly to her. But unfortunately, when she inherits that money, she's going through a messy divorce. Potentially half of her inheritance could walk out the door with that divorce. And I know that's a real worry for a lot of my clients. I don't know if you come across that as well, Marcus.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we want to be able to control assets we're giving away with some regard. You want to protect what you've worked hard, for over many years, and you don't want to see it then fall into hands that, you'd never envisage. You want it to kind of stay as best it can within most people's bloodline or, your chosen route of beneficiary. But unless you have your plan in place and it's set in stone as to what might happen in these regards, then the likelihood is, if should one of your children, for example, divorce, unless you put these measures in place, the likelihood is that any inheritance or gifts that you've given them are likely to partially at least end up in the hands of somebody you'd rather not receive it.
Absolutely. And I quite often say that it's really important to make sure that your wills reflect that. So by getting a good solicitor on board, you can make sure that your wills include a will trust, which means that, yes, you can still gift your assets to your daughter, your son, whoever, but it would be gifted via a trust wrapper, which means that it's not essentially all of theirs immediately in their estate. So if they are going through a divorce when they inherit it, for example, they don't all of a sudden have all this money. It's sort of, they have a right to it under trust, but they don't physically have all that money in their bank, which has a much sort of more positive outcome really for the family money that's been inherited.
Absolutely, and obviously we all have within Integrity 365, we are trusted partners who we can refer people if they need help in that regard as well. Yeah, absolutely. Please do speak to us. If any of the points are obviously struck a chord, but please, seek help as and when it's needed, and please don't duck your head in the sand and hope that everything's going to be okay. It might turn out okay, but with a bit of pre-planning and making sure you know what you're doing, that's going to provide you with the best outcome.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, it's not all doom and gloom, is it? There's also sort of things to consider when children are potentially looking to marry, is that, there's things like you can have like a prenuptial agreements that are really popular nowadays. You can even have a sort of a divorcing agreements and things like this. There's all sorts of legal documents that you can actually do to make sure that it's done in the right way. So that's why it's really important to seek help. And as I say, it's not just from your solicitor, it's also from your financial advisor and the emotional side of things as and when you're going through things as well. I guess from my perspective, that's probably most of the areas sort of covered as a brush, broad brush, but it's just really to stress the importance of getting the right help, I would say.
Yeah, I completely agree. Make sure self-help first of all, go through that emotional journey and seek help in that regard as would be most appropriate to yourself. Try different things, try people's suggestions, speak to people. And then at that point, once you're emotionally ready to go through the divorce process, seek legal counsel and, speak to your financial advisor, speak to us. Let us, hold your hand through that journey and, hopefully make it more comfortable than it might otherwise be.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, thank you ever so much for joining me, Marcus. It's really great to have a conversation with you. Obviously, if anyone's got any sort of questions or queries about anything, then please don't hesitate to get in touch with your advisor, and hopefully we'll be able to work through it along your side. Thanks a lot. Speak to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.